which is kind of about taking a demand-driven approach to communication and listening to the public and acting on what you know and learn. And then finally, compelling communication, which is it's an imperative nowadays because you need to have content and messages that stand out in a crowded and often contested environment. And here is where insights from behavioral science, for example, are so crucial, and this is something that Chiara will elaborate further on. So with this stage set, I'll talk about a little bit of what we found. So the COVID-19 response, and because of the scale and nature of the pandemic, was quite singular, and communication took a pivotal role in addressing the challenges that were emerging, whether at the stage of the outbreak or during the vaccination drive, for example. And this is where we saw a lot of new ideas and or existing ideas being adapted and deployed at larger scale by governments. It's really been an accelerator for the innovation and the function. And with this, we saw three main trends internationally in how governments adjusted their communication. The first is how data became a catalyst for more precise and specific evidence-based communication. Data was the factor that allowed governments to really know what content to put out, what messages to use, what was working, what wasn't. And in the bigger picture, it's actually unlocking this possibility for a more tailor-made, personalized approach to communicating rather than the mass communication that, for example, happened when mainstream media or traditional media was dominant, perhaps. Then it also allows this kind of large-scale listening so that it really makes for that two-way dialogical communication that is more conducive to having better outcomes for effectiveness, for policy implementation, and for really connecting with citizens. So this is also opening the door to automation and transformation that cut down to like the everyday tactics and practices that are used to communicate with the public. The second trend has to do with a little bit of realization by many governments and institutions of the limitations that their channels have for communicating, especially in a context where trust is low and the environment is contested. And so we've seen a reliance on third-party messengers, and this has to do with influencers, for example. We know social media influencers have been very big in recent campaigns, but also at a more granular level, community members that have a profile and a platform to reach audiences that are more marginalized, vulnerable, that have different levels of trust in institutions and government, or for whom simply the mainstream content doesn't resonate with them. So this is an important transformation, and I think I would like to say it also speaks to a bigger change or shift that we might be seeing in this space, which has to do with the fact that there's many and diversified sources of information, and the traditional gatekeepers are losing their relative importance, perhaps, and especially when you break down to different audience groups. And so you have a situation where top-down communication and perhaps even two-way communication is not necessarily enough, and you need to build a more networked approach to how you do it. You need to build coalitions, and you need to earn your reach by widening your bases and breaking down. And it's more collaborative and requires a little bit more of a legwork at the base, I guess. But I'd be happy to discuss this later if there's time. And then the last trend that we spotted, which is a very prevalent one, and of course, behavioral insights is not new to communication, but during the pandemic, whether on the communication front or the policy, it was kind of a common denominator of understanding how to get people to keep safe and follow the right information. So we definitely saw a big growth in its use in communication, And interestingly, not just in nudging or motivating certain behavior changes, but also taking an approach to understanding how people think, how they consume content, what they retain, what they overlook, the information overload that they were exposed to. And this has been pivotal, especially when you think about the responses to mis and disinformation and what interventions such as debunking or pre-bunking have been deployed and tested, which are really grounded in this psychological behavioral aspect of understanding public. So these are the three kind of big trends that we thought were innovating a little bit how communication was conducted. They were making it more responsive, inclusive, and compelling, but also the common factor to all of them is that they really rely on insights and knowledge, and they're really data-driven. It's the core of what makes them work. I'll close with a bit of a parenthesis on what needs to be done, because of course we know that this is all very excellent, but governments around the world need to build the capability to do this, and I think some are some way ahead, others are still working to implement this, and from our research there emerged three main institutional prerequisites, which is what countries will need to invest in if they are thinking of reforming the function to really bring out this effectiveness. And so the first is building an agile function. So innovation in itself is important, and you need to have the culture that enables this across your team. But also there's a need across the board, I would say, for really upgrading the mandate for communication with a focus on these inclusiveness, on the responsiveness that are perhaps a little bit ahead of when the function was originally regulated and conceived. The second is to rethink the skills and the profiles of communication teams. We know, for example, in the United Kingdom, there's an ongoing reform which has this as a core pillar of the changes. But you have a more specialized and even more multidisciplinary function that requires bringing in new skills and capabilities. I wanted to say just on this topic of skills and professionalization, this is something that the OECD has launched a new initiative on. We're working to build with our community of communication practitioners a public communication network which serves as a platform for exchanging and learning among peers and to bring in all those emerging practices and lessons that every country is experiencing at the same time. And so forums like this are obviously very important to advancing the function and the work of communicators. And then the last point, and I'll close, is that obviously technology and data can have very harmful applications or even misapplications that are unintentional. And we've seen in this research that the ethical standards tend not to be up to speed or prescriptive enough when it comes to some of the newer aspects of communication to do with artificial intelligence, to do with data privacy, sponsored content, etc. So this is ethical standards are an important prerequisite to really harnessing well the innovations that we've looked at. So thank you very much. I'll pass it forward.
Thank you. You know, COVID shifted everyone out of their comfort zone, I think, and that includes the government on policy formation and reformation and reorganizing themselves, but also the citizens as well. Now, you talked about that networked approach, and I think that was important because there's also this, you know, concepts of transparency, accountability, and the open government concepts. And when it comes to policy design, you know, you're dealing with huge sets of data, behavioral data, which belongs to citizens at the end of the day. So I think that sense of, or that notion of privacy is also important, as you mentioned, and the ethical standards. Chiara, we'll be moving on to you now. What kind of research approaches and capability is needed for institutions looking to design behavioral intervention against mis and disinformation?
Thank you so much for a great question. It's an easy one in a way because we just released a guide to apply behavioral science in an ethical way to public policy, but I won't talk too much about that. I will focus my presentation more on the misinformation experiment, just to provide enough time to the other speakers as well. So what I would like to do today with you is to explain you a little bit why behavioral science is important for strategic communication. I will tell you a little bit about what we're doing at the OECD in this space, and finally I will share with you some experimental data from an experiment we did with Canada and France. So why? Why behavioral insights for public communication and strategic communication? When you think about it, most of today's challenges involve human behavior in one way or another. It could be about how much energy you consume, if you decide to go vote at an election or a referendum, or if you decide to share misinformation online or not. We know that. However, we often still assume an unrealistic model of human behavior. What does this mean? Maybe some of you are familiar with the theory of dual processes in our brain, which basically is about having two different systems in our brain, one fast system and one slow system. We all have these two systems, and one is very automatic and intuitive, and the other one is analytic and very deliberative. So why I'm telling you this? Because when you think about it, the way in which most of traditional communication and strategic comms, certainly not by the people in this room, but I'm talking generally here, most of traditional communication is designed for the system 2, so for a system in our brain that we rarely use. The reality is that most of the time, our brain goes automatically in system 1, making very intuitive and quick decisions, and very often these decisions are biased. Now, what is behavioral science is just a field of knowledge really drawing on empirical data to hopefully design communications that are more fitted for humans. Now, at the OECD, we do a bunch of different things in this space, but we basically do 3 things. So we convene, we enable, and we advise. So I don't want to spend too much about it, but exactly as Carlotta mentioned, we convene a lot of experts in this field. We have more than 100 behavioral experts from 46 governments, and we also provide advice on specific policy issues to governments, and this is what I would like to share with you today. So this is a report we just launched a couple of weeks ago, and you can scan it on the QR code here. And it was really an international effort to try and understand why people share fake news online, and if there's anything that we can do about it. So why we did this? Well, I think this conference is all about it. We know that new digital technologies and the information ecosystem really enable a growth of mis and disinformation online. The behavioral lens here is that we know that the spread of fake news online is very much linked to individual choices, okay? So if we fail to understand why people share misinformation, there's a risk to basically come up with communication strategies and policy that won't work in the end. So we wanted to both understand the cognitive factors influencing the decisions of people, but also try to understand how information ecosystems influence our behavior, with the objective of hopefully better design and deliver communications to tackle misinformation. So misinformation is a global challenge. Fake news don't know any borders, of course, so they don't stop only in Turkey, for example. So knowing that, we started an international partnership. So we tried to put countries together, to collaborate together, to co-design and test together the same solutions at the same time. And so we collaborated with the Canadian government in the Privy Council office and with with the Ministère de la Fonction Publique in France. And basically what we did is we did these first cross-border collaborations having 3 objectives. 1, better understand why people share misinformation on social media. Number 2, evaluate the impact of a couple of behavioral interventions on choices to share fake news. And lastly, starting to co-develop a set of best practices to inform policies against misinformation. So when we did this, there was this very famous Nature paper. Long story short, basically, this group of famous researchers highlighted that one of the reasons why people share fake news online is because they are distracted, because they are not paying enough attention. So they discovered that by providing a little bit of an accuracy prompt, people were sharing less fake news. So with this in mind, we tested 2 different things online to boost attention of people before they engage with news online. One was what it's called an accuracy evaluation nudge. So we will ask people to rate the truthiness or the accuracy of a piece of news, and then they will see fake news. And the other one was a digital media literacy tips list. So this is something the people were saying something similar to this. So very quick tips, something like investigate the source or watch for unusual formatting. Quick tips to recognize fake news online, okay? So it was an experiment, so it's called a randomized control trials, where you have a bunch of people, almost 2,000 people, and they all saw 7 pieces of fake news and 7 true news, okay? And we divided them in several groups. 2 groups were the treatment that I just showed you, and then we had a control group to see the effect. And then we will ask them, well, you can't see that, unfortunately, but we would ask them, do you believe this? And to what extent you would like to share this on social media. The first thing that we found that I think it's important to share is that people were, of course, more likely to believe true news than fake news. This is expected. However, we also found that the differences in intention to share fake news was 4 times smaller compared to the difference in accuracy beliefs. What does it mean? It means that actually a lot of people may share fake news even if they don't believe fake news to be true. So believing in fake news, it's not the same as sharing fake news, okay? So there's something here that I think as governments we should pay attention to. The second thing, so I'm showing the results from the experiment, so I will show the effects of our interventions. So these are the results, and you can see that the tips that I just showed to you reduce the intention of sharing fake news by 21%. So the people who saw those messages were 21% less likely to share fake news online. This is massive because it's quite a simple intervention. So we were very pleased with this, and this is the main thing that we found. And the cost of doing this is basically nothing. Now, the other thing I wanted to know is also why people share misinformation and who are these people. So for the sake of time, I will just show you this briefly. But basically, the hypothesis was that sharing fake news was connected to how much people trusted different things, social media, government, etc., but also to some psychological or cognitive factors, such as conspiracy mentality, openness to evidence, and a bunch of different things. And so we basically identified 3 groups of people: people who don't trust anybody, the greenish people there, people who trust more or less everybody, the pink group that you see there, and people who trust institutions mostly, and not so much social media, the gold group that you see on the cluster. We hypothesized that these cognitive factors will influence how much people believe and share fake news, and that's exactly what we found. So the people who are non-trusting or trust a lot social media were more likely to believe and share fake news, while the people who trusted institutions were less likely to share fake news. Now, a summary of findings. First, we found that some individuals may share fake news even if they don't believe in fake news. Second, the tips on digital media literacy had the greatest impact on intentions to share fake news. And lastly, that differences in trust and information consumption shape our beliefs and the likelihood of sharing fake news online. Okay, so 3 key messages, and then I will close. 1, don't ignore the human factor. Okay, if anything, these results will show you that take into account how people think, their cognitive abilities, factors, etc., is something that really, as communicators, we all should take into account when we want to tackle misinformation. Second thing, this experiment didn't touch the content of the news at all. Okay, we didn't. It's not about deciding what's true and what's not true. It's about empowering people and building resilience in online users so they can recognize misinformation by themselves. I don't think it's our role to decide what's true and what's not true because everything is relative. And so I think it's important to stress this, that it's not about the content, but it's about the people. And lastly, something that I am very passionate about is to put governments together to co-design and test things, because it's impossible for only one government to try and define and tackle misinformation by themselves. And so with this, I thank you very much.
You mentioned the citizens' digital media literacy. I think that's a huge thing, even for journalists themselves, because at a time when things are evolving at a speed of seconds, fact-checking is a huge obstacle that you fight against time. Even for journalists, that's a huge labor-laden issue, which many times people tend to forget or ignore for their comfort. And you said disinformation knows no border. I think that's also huge, and why citizens tend to fall for this disinformation, or what triggers them. These were some of the interesting takeaways for me, so thank you. So Tom, what do we do with all this data? How do we analyze this? From the steps that I take to come here that is recorded on my cell phone to my medical records. The governments would deal all sort of data from these to the tweets that we share on social media. What are some of the ethical challenges with the emergence of these new technologies and behavioral insight for communicators in government?
It's a big question. So I very much appreciate, I should say first, I very much appreciate the invitation here today, particularly because recently I became much less important than I used to be. I just changed jobs.
If you're here, you're very important.
Thank you. I just have to also, but I also noticed that I have slightly less fancy shoes than everyone else up here. So I feel like I'm kind of, but I wanted to say, but I wanted to share more of an experience rather than just talk about it generally, because I wanted to share an experience from my previous job. So I used to work in the European Commission, and one of the things I miss very much is access to a huge amount of wonderful, interesting data. And I wanted to, well, first to give you a little context, I want to tell you about one of the most interesting, in my opinion, one of the most interesting communication exercises that we embark upon, which is the State of the European Union. So the State of the European Union is a speech somewhat inspired by the State of the Union in the United States. And the idea is that the President of the Commission addresses everyone in the European Union, but also beyond, at the same time, to kind of map out future policy priorities and reflect on the previous year. And it's interesting for me as a communicator, because what you essentially have is everybody's being communicated across the whole European Union, who I was concerned with communicating with. We're using all of our platforms and we're using all of our tools. And it essentially means that the same topics, the same themes are dropped all across the continent all at the same time, which gives one a unique opportunity to reflect on the data that's coming in, and we have all sorts of data. I made a little list for myself so I wouldn't forget anything, but we have things like political reporting, so we have reports coming in from the halls of power. We have media monitoring, seeing how things are taking off in papers and in media across the continent. We also have social media data, and we have web data, we have polling, we have broadcast data. Anyway, to give you an idea, there's a lot of data. So my job in that context was to receive all of the reports from all of these different people and to try and make sense of them, which ruined my life for a couple weeks at a time, for a couple weeks every year. So I'd tell my wife that I wasn't coming home for a while, and then I'd lock myself in the office and I'd sweat and I'd read and I'd try to make sense of everything. And what I would essentially look at was a series of different things. So I'd first of all look at how our communications was performing. So I'd compare it to last year, and I'd see where we were doing better, where we were doing worse. And I also looked at the kind of political mood and the reception of the different themes, how they landed, how different people were talking about them. And then I'd look at the dynamics of those conversations. So we'd be in situations where you'd have like climate, because we were dealing with such a diverse audience, or such diverse audiences. The conversation, if you were talking climate in Sweden, you were talking about forestry and the economy. But if you were talking about climate in Greece, you were talking about forest fires and water quality. So it was a lot of reflection on how the dynamics of the conversations were going, so we could kind of inform our communicators as they moved forward. But it wasn't just about our own, it wasn't just a kind of an inward-looking thing, it was also an outward-looking thing. The example I wanted to share was from the State of the European Union 2020, which was just an interesting example of how we learned one interesting thing about one specific audience that we communicated to. So when the data came back, they were like the same topics were resonating all across Europe. If they were climate, health, not surprising because it was late 2020, foreign affairs, and the economy, and the same dynamic would emerge all the time, which was that the topics would take on lives of their own and transform and be discussed in different ways. And that held across most of our channels, but not all of them. We had, so across broadcast news, across written media, across web clicks, across a whole bunch of different areas, it was just the same. We were getting a lot of the same. Even in our political reports, we were getting the same themes coming up, but social media was different. Social media, one of the top themes in I think it was about 13 or 14 countries, was LGBTQI rights. So there was one mention, which was a relatively short mention in the speech, of LGBTQI rights, and across a number of countries on social media, this shot up and became like a hot topic. And so the question we had to ask was why? This is one of the good things about, or the interesting things about having a big pile of data. You don't always come to it and ask it questions. Sometimes you walk up to a big pile of data and you poke it until a question falls out. And then, so we were asking why. And we kind of had several different ideas about why this might have been. Was it because we were soft, squishy cosmopolitans and our audiences on social media liked this type of topic and it resonated with them? But then when we dug in and looked at the detail, that wasn't true. Because it wasn't always a positive conversation. It was, in fact, there were people debating all sorts of different aspects of the mention in the speech. So it wasn't that. And then we also had to ask ourselves, was it because on social media we have a younger audience, and this is particularly a way to reach young people? And again, the answer was no, because once we dug into the data, it was because, we discovered that it wasn't just young people discussing it, it was people of all ages. It was also a lot of interest groups, a lot of NGOs, a lot of different types of organizations. And so it wasn't any of those, and a lot of our presumptions we had to throw out the window when we looked at that. And I want to share the answer to that question that I thought was most convincing to me, but as the speaker from Malaysia earlier mentioned, is that a lot of the time when you come presenting data, you can't come in and just present hard facts and say this is the answer, because ultimately it's probably challengeable in some ways. But the one I found most convincing was that social media is more of a natural outlet for people who have an interest in these topics and themes, because they do not necessarily have access to the standard halls of power. They don't have access to newspaper editorial rooms. They don't have access to TV studios. They don't have access to the halls of power historically. So instead, they overcorrect towards social media, because social media also has gatekeepers, much like other media, but these gatekeepers are algorithms, and they discriminate in different ways. But access and building a platform on them is easier in some senses. So therefore, what do we learn from this? Well, what we learned was that in the medium-long term, we learned what type of messages resonated on different platforms with our audiences. We learned we learned a little bit about the nature of our audiences on different platforms, or on a specific platform, a specific channel. And then we also learned the value of chewing over data and taking quite a long time to reflect upon those things. I also fully recognized that I did not necessarily answer your question directly, or at all in some parts, but I had a story I wanted to tell, so I just went for it. I hope that's okay.
And I think that was quite interesting, at least, maybe the answer would have been less interesting than the story you shared about all the sets of data. You mentioned about all these sets of data where you would say, I'm not going to be home for a while, to your wife, and I think data enables, valuable predictions, and social media, you mentioned, gave us some of the unpredictable insights, and I think that perhaps maybe because it is also a platform where many feel more comfortable sharing their stories or engaging in some sort of discussion on topics where they wouldn't otherwise let's say, in a personal conversation. So I think social media provides that for the average citizen, where this could be dangerous sometimes. There could be, we talked about misinformation and disinformation, but at times it's an open space. So it's, of course, valuable, and it may surprise us, as you mentioned. Eugene, Tom talked about all these data sets that he would analyze to seek some of the questions or find out some answers. When it comes to audience insights, it's almost impossible to make some sort of communication analysis and generate related policies when it comes to the governments or institutions. What are some strategic tools out there where this data-based insight can become valuable? And maybe you would like to elaborate on the Irish example, for example.
Yeah, great, and thanks very much. And I should say at the start, thanks a million to the organisers of the event. I know from bitter experience how much work goes into organising these things, and so I appreciate all the work that's gone in behind this. It's fantastic. And thanks to everybody for really interesting presentations earlier on today. I should also thank Tom for the compliment on the shoes. I presume we're talking about my ones.
I just need to make a comment about that, which was on my mind, but I forgot. He's the most comfortable right now when it comes to dress
exactly.
and the shoes, I would assume.
He was wiser than all of us. So I'll try and answer at least some of your question with reference to the Irish example. So I work in the Government Information Service. I hope you can hear me okay. Which resides in the Department of the Taoiseach, which is the Irish Prime Minister's office, but on the institutional side. And I was very pleased to hear a presenter earlier empathising with the stress of institutional communications, because that's not always recognised, but it exists. So, talking about COVID, and you're probably all groaning, not another COVID presentation, because we've all heard an awful lot of them over the last while. We also, if you're like me working in government communications, have been talking about COVID probably every day for the guts of 3 years. And we've moved on a little bit. The world's moved on into another global, or a series of global crises. But I think actually that makes this a really good time to talk about COVID. The temptation, particularly in government communications, is just to roll straight into the next thing. And we talked about reactive and trying to be strategic. And being strategic, I think, means taking a pause, taking a step back, and trying to learn some lessons from what we've just been through. It might sound strange to say it, but actually some of COVID was positive. There were positive things to it. Certainly in the realm of communications, which is all I can speak to, but I know across the board, there are positive things to take from this. We spoke earlier, COVID has enhanced a lot of what we've been trying to do over the years. And we talk, this is about better connection with citizens and better communication with citizens. And certainly in Ireland, something we've tried to do from an institutional perspective is to improve how we communicate with citizens. And those reforms have been ongoing for the last number of years at a relatively slow pace, because we thought we had time. And then COVID arrived and we realized, no, we don't have time. We have to do this now. What it did was it sort of validated, for want of a better word, some of the things we'd put in place, some of the things that we thought were important and were working towards. One of them, and I've just put up, this is probably the biggest screen my slides have ever been on, some of the communications output, say for example, during COVID. One of the innovations we put in, and many countries will already have done this, is to have a recognizable identity for government. And we talk about better connecting with citizens. You can't connect with citizens if they don't recognize when you're actually speaking to them as a state. And I don't mean in terms of the political government, I mean the wider government. So we introduced, I don't like using the word a brand, a unified identity, a visual identity for government. If we hadn't had this when COVID arrived, we would have had to invent it, because there was such a demand for official information, for authoritative information. What do I need to do? And we did this through many ways, but advertising was one which worked well for us. And this is just an example. These are many different agencies within the state represented on the screen here, including ourselves in the centre. But they're all working to a unified identity, so they're all easily recognizable as information from the government. So I just wanted to, there's been quite a lot of sort of, I won't say negativity, but you know, we're in a crisis and things are looking sort of grim at times, but there are positives to take from the things we've been going through. So I'm going to focus on two specific examples that I hope will sort of pick up on some of the things my colleagues have been speaking about already today. And one in particular that Carlotta mentioned was targeted communications towards your audience. Anyone working in government communications will probably recognize this problem, but at a certain stage we found ourselves saying, we need to communicate with young people. How do we communicate with the young people? They're ignoring us, they're ignoring our messages, they don't care about COVID, they're not worried about it, it's not going to affect them as much. So we're all sitting around saying, how do we do this? And the people sitting around were people like me, who were wearing a suit and had grey in their hair. There was no young people in the room, so someone had the brainwave, well, let's ask them. Ask them what they think, ask them what they want to hear, ask them what would work for them. And so we did. We gathered as many representative groups as we could, They had all been doing research. We looked at their research. And we went in with these expectations that young people didn't care. What the engagement did for us was that it confounded those expectations. We found that young people did care. Young people were struggling, really struggling. They weren't seeing themselves in the official communications. It wasn't that they were ignoring them, they just weren't relating to them. They didn't feel any empathy from everybody else towards them. The only time young people appeared in the media was around a negative story. If they had all gathered somewhere and there's a particularly high profile case of young people drinking in the streets and flouting the rules, they're the only times that young people appeared on in the news media or in any kind of communications. So the temptation, I spoke to somebody earlier about this, the temptation is to wag the finger, to say, these are the rules, you need to obey the rules and this is why. What they wanted to hear from us was their concerns reflected back to them. They wanted positive reinforcement of good behaviors. They didn't want the finger wagged, they just wanted it explained in a way that they could understand, on channels that they used. And what was really important was they wanted to recognize themselves in it. So the campaign we put together, which is this antiviral campaign, was created by young people on their channels for them. That was a big leap for us because we're used to controlling the communications we put out. So when we would see the content, it might make us a little bit nervous and uncomfortable because it's not the kind of thing normally we'd say, yeah, that's good, we'll do that on our channels. But we had to understand that this was native to their channels, this resonated with them, and we ran this, there were a couple of iterations, and it was certainly our most successful campaign, and Chiara, you can sort of look away for this bit because I talk about impressions and reach and engagement and so forth, which are all good in their own right, but as we've discussed, they're not the real metric. The real metric is the impact of your work in actuality. And we did find, and I'm not claiming credit for this just for the communications because it's too complex, we operate in a suite of interventions that people are reacting to, but certainly when case numbers, for example, in COVID went up, it was always the young people that went up first. But then conversely, when they started to come down, we found, certainly after running this, and again, I'm not claiming credit just for this campaign, the numbers did start to come down. We could see the impact of whatever we were doing. The real takeaway from this, and I think this applies to all kinds of minority groups, and it's about going beyond the data, and we talked about the human aspect, and it's about that sort of age-old technique of listening. So particularly in a crisis, the instinct is to communicate and communicate and communicate, but sometimes that involves not saying anything and listening to what our audiences want, trying to understand what they're actually hearing from us, because the messages we think we're putting out quite often are not the messages that are being received. And the only way to understand that is to interact, to engage with citizens. And certainly one of the things that our policy colleagues are understanding following COVID is that need for engagement and the need for communications to be wrapped up in the whole process, not just something at the end of the process. I'll return to that a little bit later.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, not quite. Sorry. One last bit. Sorry, I won't go on too much longer. I just want to introduce SAM to everybody. So SAM is the social activity measure. We talked about data, and we had bunches of data on everything and anything. We had polling around opinions and attitudes. But for much of our time in COVID, our biggest defense was actually people's behavior. Before vaccines, the only way of preventing the spread was through behavior. But we weren't assessing behavior, we weren't trying to measure behavior. We were asking for opinions. So, are you obeying the rules? Yes, I'm obeying the rules. Instead of saying, what are you doing? Did you wear a mask when you were there? Did you meet people when you were there? Did you shake hands with somebody when you were there? So with our Economic and Social Research Institute, we devised a survey to try and measure in some way that behavior. And that again, and I think this is the thing about research and behavioral insights, it's about confounding expectations. There was a presumption at one stage that people were fed up with restrictions, and so they weren't complying with restrictions. But this behavioral research found that, yes, people were fed up with restrictions, but that wasn't predicting behavior, that wasn't driving behavior. Other things were driving behavior. Worry was driving behavior. Coherence of restrictions was driving behavior. So the more incoherent people found restrictions, the less they complied. And that's a boon to people in communications, because that's something we can fix. That's something we can work on. We can improve our communications to really emphasize why we're doing what we're doing, to make sure that those restrictions are coherent and that we communicate regularly. And certainly we took this one, for example, and really built a communication strategy around it. And you can see the nice sort of level bit in the middle of that graph there. That was the sort of most successful period of that, when we had a really clear, concise message that we could communicate. People found restrictions coherent during that period of time, and the numbers, all the metrics measuring the spread of the transmission, leveled off and fell during that period of the time. So it was a real clear demonstration of how those behavioral insights helped us devise a communication strategy and how that had impact on the ground. And then finally, I just wanted to leave us with a quote from our colleagues in the UK. As I talked about positives and the positives to take from COVID. And I think for us in communications, and I think it's one of the reasons why the four of us are here, for example, in that the work we're doing with the OECD, with our policy colleagues in the OECD, is this is being more widely recognized because of COVID, that communications is another lever for government alongside legislation, regulation and taxation. Communications should be part of the whole process of policy making, not just a press release at the end of it. And if anybody has been to communications conferences over the years, you'll have heard us, people like me, go on and on about this, but I think actually people are starting to recognize this as a result of COVID. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Eugene. I think traditionally, or even at the age of AI, that human factor has always played a great role in communications. And you mentioned, let us speak to them or let's talk to them. I think that is something that is often ignored due to the top-down strategies built in the offices with the men with gray hair. So I think that's a huge, that was very impactful from what I can understand. Now we have about 10 minutes, so I would like to allocate about a minute each for some key messages, and then the remaining 5 minutes we can take some questions from the audience, if that's okay with you. And Carlota, I would like to go back to you, and maybe I would like to initiate that last message with a question. Often that political communication is mixed with the public communication. The governments deliver political communication, but at the same time, the public communication comes from the politicians very often as well. At time of crisis, what would be some of the strategies that states should, I guess, employ to make that differentiation so that the messages are clear for the public? Thank you.
Thank you. I think ultimately the communication, it's a policy communication. So the policy is the policy of the government, and the messenger, the person conveying it, obviously needs to amplify a core message. But what COVID demonstrated is that there's not a single messenger, and a single messenger is not going to go very far, even if it is the president, the Pope, any top figure. There's grassroots leaders, people that have a standing in their communities. There's people who are influential with young people that are not going to be the same ones, and it really comes down to that. You have to have a choir of voices, and increasingly, I would say the important thing is to earn this following and this collaborative willingness from the groups in society that you need to engage to deliver the policies for their impact. And I would say that's the big takeaway. Thank you. And Chiara, we can take your message.
Just very, very briefly, I think if I had to choose only one message for this crowd, it would be, don't assume that communication itself is enough to change people's behavior. This is my technical side speaking here. But I think that in all our presentations, we showed you that it's not because you're telling something that it's enough for people to change their behavior. In the misinformation study, we saw, for example, that people still share misinformation even if they don't believe them to be true. So don't focus about that intention-action gap, and focus also on changing people's behavior, not only on communicating information.
I think behavior and understanding the behavior is key to, from what you're telling me. And Tom, the data sets and the behavior, how do we connect the two, if you could?
Yeah, also not too easy. Yeah, so I think ultimately, it actually is also sort of linked a little bit to your ethics question from before, because I've been thinking about that while I've been sitting here and feeling guilty about the fact that I didn't answer it. But I think that the same goes for kind of connecting what we learn to behavior, and it's also a theme that I've seen emerge among all of the speakers here, which is that we don't communicate for fun. We do it to achieve things and to achieve specific things, and we should do it in a way that we should use the data in a way that to achieve those things. So I come from the field of public communications, and so whenever I'm wondering about how one should apply this data, whenever I'm wondering about whether it's a good idea or ethical to apply it in this way, I kind of take a step back and ask myself, what is my role as a public communicator? What is my objective here? What am I trying to achieve? And there's a list that I could run off. Like, we provide high quality information to facilitate debates. We act to make governments transparent and to share the best quality information to equip people. Well, incidentally, one of the reasons why dis and misinformation is a threat is because it removes people's ability to make high quality choices or to make informed decisions. But also, we try to cultivate trust and create trusting environments, because again, if you want people to follow, say, COVID measures, you need them to trust you. So we cultivate trust in governance, and one of the ways we do that is by providing this high quality information. But then ultimately it's about, we come back to, and I think it's a tension a lot of people can relate to here, or I imagine a lot of people here would relate to, is we do have to sell our policies, but also a lot of the time we are public communicators, so it's the politicians who are ultimately responsible and rolling out the policies and proposing the policies. So a lot of the time, I think we should focus around supporting these policy goals and showing that we're doing them in the best way possible, and ultimately making sure that every piece, I like to think of every piece of communication, the question I always ask myself is either, what am I trying to get people to stand up and do after this? What's the most efficient way to do that? Or what problem am I solving with this piece of communication? So I think keeping focused around one's role is very helpful for that, for making sense and using data in the correct way.
Thank you very much. Eugene, Tom talked about cultivating trust, particularly in policy making and delivering that policy. If I could take maybe a few key messages for the next 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's an interesting question actually, and particularly now, and our colleagues in the OECD have a recent survey demonstrating just how low trust is in institutions, and I think that was 2021 that survey was taken in. Yep, so getting the tail end of still a bit of a COVID bounce. I think if you did it now, it might even be lower again in terms of trust in institutions. For me, it's not an easy question, because as I think we saw earlier, it's been declining for quite a while. Engagement is key though, and it's difficult, it takes time, we don't often have time, but it's hard for people to trust institutions that they can't relate to or they can't see. It's really important to engage with citizens, and that means politicians understand this, I think, better than institutions. It means a bit of face-to-face communication. It means talking to people, listening to them, asking them, So it's not enough just to talk at them. We need to ask them. We need to ask them how they're receiving our messages and to understand what they are receiving when we broadcast out whatever our message is, whatever the most important message is to us. That's not necessarily what they're looking for. One lesson from COVID is that constantly, because governments are faced with lobby groups, are faced with a lot of noisy, loud voices in the media, which aren't always reflected in what the public actually think and what the citizens are actually concerned with. So I think that difficult, tricky thing of engaging with citizens and asking, talking to them is the one real key takeaway. And as I said, I don't have an easy answer to how you achieve that regularly and consistently. It's expensive, it's time consuming, but and I'd certainly be interested in people's views on that.
Thank you very much. You know, at one point I knew about this, let's call it a quote, which said, oftentimes people think that they are communicating, but what they do is actually take turns in talking. So rather than engaging, having active listening, and I think the same goes for the government to citizens as well. I'd like to thank the audience and of course my distinguished speakers and the organizers for such a great event. I think we may have time for a couple questions, Alican, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, if we could just stand up, can I get a microphone? Bir mikrofon alabilsek buraya. Evet, sizde. Bakın. Sonra hanımefendi alacağız.
Hi. My question is for Carlotta. Is there any way to make the social media ethical, meaning that social media can distinguish truth and disinformated data? Because its aim has been to keep their users online, not to educate them. Since they are using our behavioral surplus thanks to human mining, as indicated in the age of surveillance capitalism. So, and the American court has been indicated that it's a matter of security, not privacy, due to 9/11. So, what's the way to social media make it ethical?
Thank you very much. I think, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, this is a very big question that a lot of people are tackling with because there is no obvious answer. So what makes social media appealing to people is this open space where information can be shared and anyone can have a voice in a platform. And the fact that everyone has a voice in a platform can sometimes be problematic. Social media companies ultimately are commercial enterprises. They have values, they are trying to make changes that they see compatible with their commercial ends and the social implications of their work, but it really comes down to governments to regulate them. But this is a bigger question and one that touches into some of the deepest values of a democracy. So I think we're not seeing kind of the type of solutions and the speed of solutions that we expect from them, and that's why interventions that are grounded in communication or behavioral interventions or other types of work, from increasing media literacy and social resilience, this breadth of work that is happening across different disciplines and policy areas is part of building a solution in an environment where social media will likely continue to be imperfect and people themselves will continue to be imperfect. And I would say disinformation and misinformation has existed before social media was a thing. And I don't think we'll necessarily ever get rid of it. It's more how we stand up to it as societies and how we sort of uphold certain values and resilience in education that will make the biggest difference at the end of the day, because technology will find a way of, tangling itself out of the regulation and the boundaries that we put up.
Thank you. And we have one more question.
Hello, welcome to Turkey. Kısa öz iki sorum olacak, Türkçe olacak. Türkiye'de haberin doğrulanması veya yanlışlanması konusunda gece gündüz çalışan şirketler bulunmakta. Örneğin Teyit.org bu bağlamda çok başarılı bulduğum bir şirket. Ben de bir gazeteciyim. İnanıyorum da farklı ülkelerde de yani buna bağlı olarak farklı isimlerde şirketler olduğunu düşünüyorum, biliyorum. Peki siz bu oluşumlar için neler düşünüyorsunuz? İkinci sorumda bunun teşvik edicilik adına hükümetlerin neler yapılabileceği, neler yapabilecekleri adına neler düşünüyorsunuz? Bunu sormak istiyorum. Teşekkürler.
That there are companies in Turkey that play roles in verifying and discrediting news stories. She gave an example of one. What are your thoughts on sort of the development of this process on companies outside of Turkey?
I mean, it's only positive. The more companies fact-checking. I mean, in Ireland we've got many different media outlets, all of whom engage in fact-checking. Some specialise in it, and I mean, look, it's only healthy. The more people doing it, the more beneficial to society in general. I don't think there's anything negative about it. The more you encourage that kind of thing. I mean, as a former press officer, it's not always the easiest thing in the world to deal with when you've got fact-checking journalists contacting you, but it's a healthy, it can only be healthy, I think.
Anybody else?
I just wanted to add as well that fact-checking, absolutely, it's a very important part of the process, but it's not the only part of the process as well, because ultimately, a very nice way I had someone describe misinformation to me once was like pollution. It was kind of or littering, like, and it's better to kind of cultivate, like, I think putting in work to cultivate high trust environments and educate people and cultivate media literacy are incredibly important. Like, you have to consider it as part of a system of building stronger, more reliable information environments, I think.
Can I just add very quickly, this is great that you're doing this, and a lot of the efforts of the European Commission is on fact-checking as well. But just very quickly want to say that fact-checking is not the only solution, exactly as Tom said, for two main reasons, in my humble opinion. One, some things are very hard to be checked. It's if ever impossible. Truth, again, is something can be true today and true tomorrow, okay, and false tomorrow. And the second thing is that imagine that, you know, we removed all fake news from the online world tomorrow. Impossible, but imagine, even in that situation, people, human beings, will always share misinformation in one way or another. So fact-checking is far from being enough, okay? So please kind of always think about a holistic solutions, and not only about the content and the checking of the facts.
Well, because I remember, because indeed you've reminded me, because you said that the Commission works a lot on fact-checking, and I remember reading some of our research that was illustrated how sometimes fact-checking or correcting mis or disinformation, especially if it's a smaller issue, it can in fact spread the misinformation or reinforce the belief in itself, so it can actually ultimately end up part of the problem. So it's very important to choose the types of information that you deal with when you're working in this area, because it's not because, for example, an institution or a news agency amplifying something by saying it's not true might accidentally get it to more people, and on the kind of behavioral end as well, there I remember reading that it can even, seeing the information again, even in the context of fact-checking, can reinforce the belief. So it can remind people of, oh yes, I believe this. And so it's a highly complex issue.
Someone said earlier, you have to choose your battles. And I think that applies to that.
And I think bias about facts is also, facts are not just facts, so there is bias angle too. Once again, I'd like to thank the organizers and my distinguished speakers, as well as the audience for their patience. We exceeded our time by 10 minutes, and I think that's great. Thanks, Alican and Andrea, for bearing with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mehmet. And thank you, all four of these panelists, for really insightful discussion. It's greatly appreciated. Well, I'm not going to take a long time to introduce our next speaker, but this really is a compelling person to listen to. At the very beginning, we talked about how wars are fought today and the role of cyberspace, both on the battlefield and in the media. So our next speaker, George Tiki, I'd like to welcome him to the stage. He is the Media and Communications Director to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and he'll be delivering this address, Cyber Battles in Conventional War.